Hi, this is Peter narrating for meta.ai Studios. In this video, I'll be narrating the story of Joseph, summarized in pictures. Joseph's childhood starts off on a very rocky note. Firstly, his beloved mom dies while giving birth to his little brother, Benjamin. And secondly, his family life is filled with hostility, as he is hated by his 10 older brothers. Okay. Let me first run through his family background so you get a clearer picture. Joseph's father, Jacob, married 2 wives, namely, Leah and Rachel, who is Joseph's mother and Jacob's favorite wife. In addition to his wives, Jacob also has 2 concubines, namely, Bilhah and Zilpah. Leah has 6 sons, while Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah have 2 each. When Rachel dies, the responsibility of looking after her 2 sons naturally falls on their father, Jacob, and he does his best to ensure that their childhood is filled with as much joy as possible. Because of this, and also the fact that they were both born to him at an old age and by his favorite wife, Jacob dotes on them, especially Joseph, and the rest of the brothers hate Joseph because of this. In fact, they hate him so intensely that not one of them is able to speak a cordial word to him. Joseph, amidst all of this hostility, amazingly grows up to be a happy and spirited young lad. And he tries his hardest to still relate with his brothers, despite their flaming hatred. When Joseph turns 17, his father assigns him the responsibility of looking after a portion of his vast flock, alongside his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. And Jacob has a unique tunic coat of many colors, made especially for him, to mark his start in the family business. Whilst working on his new responsibility, Joseph notes the bad conduct of his brothers, and makes sure to inform his father of their distasteful activities, which only helps to fuel his brothers' animosity. One day, after all the brothers return from a hard day's work in the field, Joseph recounts a dream he had, to his brothers, even though he's fully aware that they have no interest in listening to him. He says to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all around, and bowed down to my sheaf." The brothers can't believe their ears, and are infuriated at what the dream insinuates. His brothers collectively say to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" And they detest him even more for his dreams, and for his words. Joseph then has another dream some days later, and he hurries over to his brothers to recount his second dream. And this time around, his father happens to be there with them. He says to them, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." After his retelling of his second dream, even his father, Jacob, takes offense at what the dream insinuates, and scolds him in front of his brothers saying, "Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come, to bow down to the earth before you?" When Jacob retires to his bedroom chambers, however, he reflects on Joseph's dream, and wonders what it really means. After some time passes, Jacob sends Joseph to check up on his 10 older brothers, who are tending to his flock in Shechem. And Joseph obediently sets off on the journey. When he gets to Shechem, he doesn't find his brothers there, and he asks a kind passerby about their whereabouts. The man tells him that they had most likely gone to Dothan, as he had heard them talking about it earlier. Joseph thanks the man, and hurries along to Dothan, to meet up with his brothers. As he approaches them in Dothan, the brothers recognize him when he's still quite some distance from them, due to his multicolored coat. Here comes the dreamer. They sneer to one another, and they hatch a wicked plan to kill him. Let's see what becomes of his dreams when he's dead. They continue with their taunts. Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, hates Joseph just as much as the other brothers do, but he's taken aback at how far they are willing to go. He hurriedly stands before his brothers and suggests that they dump Joseph into an empty pit in the wilderness, rather than killing him. Reuben's final plan was to secretly return Joseph back to their father, without the rest of his brothers knowing. When Joseph arrives at his brother's location, they seize him and forcefully strip him of his multicolored coat, and then throw him into the empty pit. Joseph is completely astonished at their vicious attack, and pleads profusely with them to take him out of the pit. Reuben excuses himself from the group, and goes off to probably perfect his plan of rescuing Joseph. The rest of the brothers settle down for a late afternoon lunch, and pay no attention to Joseph's pleas from the pit. As they eat, they notice a company of Ishmaelite traders coming in their direction, and one of the brothers by the name of Judah makes a suggestion. He says to them, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." The rest of his brothers like this new plan a lot, and they all agree on it. When the traders reach their location, they pull out the very distressed Joseph from the pit, and sell him to the Ishmaelite traders for 20 shekels of silver. They then dip his multicolored coat into the blood of a butchered goat, so as to tell their father a convincing lie of Joseph's demise. When Reuben rejoins them, he rushes over to the pit to make sure that Joseph is still safely there. When he realizes that Joseph is not there, he tears his clothes and laments to his brothers, who don't tell him a thing. They return to their father, and show him Joseph's multicolored coat, smeared with blood, and they cook up a story of how a wild beast must have devoured him on his journey. Jacob, on seeing his dear son's coat, tears his clothes, puts a sackcloth on his waist, and mourns for many months. The rest of his children try their hardest to comfort him, but it is to no avail, as Jacob gradually withers away, due to his great sorrow. In this moment, we see Joseph's brothers feeling some sort of remorse for their actions, as the grave effect it has on their father isn't something that they had anticipated. The Ishmaelite traders head on to Egypt with Joseph, and when they get to Egypt, they sell off Joseph to Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard in Egypt, and an important officer in Pharaoh's administration. When Joseph gets to Potiphar's house, he assesses his situation, and concludes that feeling sorry for himself will do him no good, and so he settles into the responsibilities assigned to him with utmost diligence and honesty. As Joseph serves Potiphar, the Lord blesses Potiphar's household exceedingly, and Potiphar takes notice of the remarkable change. He then observes Joseph for a short time, and notes that he is an upright and an extremely hard-working young man, with the Lord on his side. And so, he makes Joseph the overseer of his entire household. In fact, the Bible puts it this way: Potiphar didn't concern himself with anything, except what he would eat or drink. As Joseph works in Potiphar's house, he grows from a regular-looking teenager to a well-built, handsome young man, having filled up nicely in all the right places. As his physique changes, Potiphar's wife can't help but notice this strapping young man, living in the same house with her, and she begins to lust after him. Day after day, she goes to him, and requests that he lays with her when Potiphar isn't around. And every time, Joseph tells her that he can't betray God and his kind master, who has graciously made him the caretaker of all his possessions. One day, when Joseph goes into the main house to carry out some of his duties, Potiphar's wife is so filled with lust that she can't help herself, and she grabs Joseph by his coat and pleads with him once again. Joseph wisely notes that he is in a very precarious situation, and he dashes out of the house as fast as his legs could manage, leaving behind his coat in her hands. Potiphar's wife is flabbergasted at his reaction, and vows to punish him for making a fool out of her. She calls the other men working for her husband, and lies to them saying that Joseph had tried to rape her. But when she managed to scream, he ran off and left behind his coat. When Potiphar arrives home, his wife tells him the same lie, and he is furious. He arrests Joseph and places him in the king's prison, without any trial. Once again, Joseph finds his circumstances altered, due to no fault of his. But rather than sulking about it, he makes himself useful, and begins to work in the prison. In this moment, we see how Joseph's resolute attitude causes him to forge ahead, regardless of the continuous setbacks. As Joseph begins working in the prison, the Lord causes him to find favor with the prison keeper. And just like before, the keeper of the prison doesn't concern himself with anything under Joseph's charge, as the Lord prospers everything that Joseph does. Sometime afterwards, the royal butler and baker offend their master, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, and are placed in the prison under Joseph's charge. When they are brought in, Joseph attends to them diligently, as he does all the other prisoners in his care, and he makes sure to take good care of them. One day, when Joseph comes over to their section, he notices their long faces, and he requests to know the reason for it. They then tell him of the dreams that they had had the night before, and are puzzled as to what they could mean. Joseph calms them down, and requests that they tell him about their dreams, as the Lord of heaven was able to interpret them. The butler recounts his dream and says, "Behold, in my dream, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded. Its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Joseph listens to him intently, and then gives him the interpretation of his dream. This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, and restore you to your place. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, according to the former manner, when you were his butler. Joseph then pleads with the butler to speak with Pharaoh on his behalf, and get him freed from his detention, as he is innocent. When the baker hears the favorable interpretation of the butler's dream, he recounts his own dream. "I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." Joseph listens to him intently, and sadly gives him the interpretation for his own dream. This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you, and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Exactly 3 days later, everything Joseph says happens exactly as he had stated. The butler is reinstated to his role in the palace, while the baker is sadly hanged. However, when the butler regains his position, he forgets all about Joseph, and doesn't bring his case before Pharaoh. Several years pass by, and Joseph bravely passes his time in prison, going about his duties diligently. But from time to time, he ponders if he would ever regain his freedom. One night, Pharaoh wakes up with a startle after a most puzzling dream. He tries to go to sleep again, and when he does, he has another frightening dream. When he wakes up in the morning, he summons all his magicians, and asks them to interpret his dream after telling them about it. But none of them know what the 2 dreams mean. Suddenly, the butler who was in his master's presence remembers his time in prison, and tells Pharaoh about Joseph and his ability to interpret dreams. Immediately, Pharaoh sends for Joseph to be brought to him. And when Joseph has been given a good shave and a change of clothes, he comes to stand before Pharaoh, who then tells him about his dreams. In the first dream, Pharaoh sees 7 ugly and gaunt cows eat up 7 fine and healthy cows. who came up before them. But the skinny cows still remain as skinny as ever. In the second dream, Pharaoh sees 7 withered and thin heads of grain. Eat up 7 full and good heads of grain that spring up before them. Joseph then interprets the dream to Pharaoh. And he says to him, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. And the 7 good heads are 7 fruitful years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine." Joseph then lets him know that the 7 years of famine will be so severe that the previous 7 bountiful years will be utterly forgotten. Joseph then advises Pharaoh to appoint a trustworthy official that will oversee the collection of 20% of the produce from the bountiful years, and that will serve as a reserve for the 7 years of famine. When Pharaoh hears Joseph's interpretations and his suggestion, he's totally amazed, and promptly makes him the second in command over the whole Egypt, and gives him the responsibility of collecting the reserve grains. He then clothes Joseph with garments of fine linen, puts a gold chain around his neck, and puts his own signet ring on Joseph's finger. He also changes Joseph's name to Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gives him an Egyptian wife, called Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph is 30 years old when he comes before Pharaoh, and it's been over a decade since he last saw his family and his father. He leaves Pharaoh's presence and immediately maps out a strategy to effectively carry out the task that has been assigned to him. He gives instructions for storehouses to be built up in every city all over Egypt, and he personally oversees the collection of the grains. Throughout the 7 bountiful years, Joseph collects and records every grain brought into the storehouses. He gathers up so much grain that they seem immeasurable as the sand of the sea, and eventually, he stops counting the stored grains. During the 7 bountiful years, Joseph's wife, Asenath, bears him 2 sons, namely Manasseh, which means, "For God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house," and Ephraim, which means, "For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction." When the 7 years of famine begin, the entire population of Egypt cry out to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says to them, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." And they run to Joseph and plead for some grains. Joseph then opens up all the storehouses in Egypt and sells grains to the Egyptians. Soon enough, the famine spreads all over the world, and people from all over the face of the earth troop to Egypt to buy some grains from Joseph. Even Jacob and his family in Canaan are not exempt from the effects of the famine. And Jacob directs his 10 sons to go down to Egypt to buy some grains. But he doesn't allow Benjamin, the youngest son and Joseph's full brother, to go with them, as he fears that some trouble might befall him. The 10 brothers set off to Egypt, and when they get there, they meet Joseph, and bow to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognizes them at once, and he remembers the dreams he had had so long ago. He speaks harshly to them, using an interpreter, and he accuses them of being spies. The 10 brothers plead their innocence, and state that they are simply there to buy some grain, and nothing else. Joseph insists on them being spies, and they respond saying that they are the sons of one man, and are 12 in number. Their youngest brother was back home with their father, while one of them was no more. Joseph acts like he doesn't believe their words, and he puts all of them in prison for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he releases them and tells them that in order for their words to be verified, they would need to bring their youngest brother to him. He then adds that one of the brothers will be confined until their youngest brother is brought before him. The rest of the brothers, upon hearing this, lament among themselves, and come to the conclusion that they are being punished for how badly they had treated Joseph so many years ago. Reuben then says to his brothers, "Did I not speak to you, saying, 'Do not sin against the boy,' and you would not listen? Therefore behold, his blood is now required." Unknowingly to them, Joseph listens in to their conversation, and after listening to them, he retreats to a corner, and weeps. When he returns back to them, he arrests Simeon, his least favorite brother, and puts him in jail. The rest of the brothers depart for Canaan with their purchased grains, but before getting home, they stop at an encampment to rest. When one of the brothers opens up his sack to feed his donkey, he sees the money he had supposedly paid for the grains, placed neatly at the top, and he is frightened. He tells his brothers of what he had seen, and the brothers are afraid, and say to one another, "What is this that God has done to us?" They arrive in Canaan, and report everything that happened in Egypt to their father. They then offload their sacks of grains, and each of the brothers are astonished to find their bundles of money placed neatly in their sacks, and they are all afraid. Jacob their father then says to them, "You have bereaved me. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. And you want to take Benjamin. All these things are against me." Reuben then promises his father that he will bring Benjamin safely, if he's allowed to go with them to Egypt, and that he is willing to have his sons killed if he doesn't fulfill this promise. But Jacob absolutely refuses to have Benjamin go with them, as he is the only memento he has of his beloved wife, Rachel. When some time passes and the grains they had obtained from Egypt gets exhausted, Jacob requests that they go to Egypt for some more grains. But his sons refuse to go down there without Benjamin. Judah then says to his father, "Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die. Both we, and you and also our little ones. I myself will be surety for him. From my hand, you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever." Jacob sighs deeply, and finally agrees for Benjamin to accompany the rest of the brothers to Egypt. He tells them to take the best fruits of Canaan, a little balm, a little honey, spices and myrrh, pistachio nuts and almonds. He also tells them to take a double payment, so as to pay for the previous purchase that was unknowingly returned to them. So all the brothers, along with Benjamin, set off for Egypt, with all the gifts, as directed by their father. When they get to Egypt, and present themselves before Joseph, he immediately orders his attendants to prepare lunch for his brothers in his home. When they are taken to Joseph's palatial abode, the brothers are frightened, and wonder if they were going to be enslaved for the money that was returned to them. They approach the head steward of Joseph's home, and ask to make an additional payment for the money that was returned. But the steward assures them that their last payment was received. The steward then brings Simeon from jail, to join them, and they prepare the gifts that they had brought for Joseph. When Joseph comes home at noon for lunch, his brothers present their gifts to him while bowing low to the ground. Joseph accepts their presents, and asks after their father. He then notices Benjamin positioned behind his older brothers, and his heart longs to embrace his full brother.